My name is Jessica. Welcome to my channel, Stitchy Witch Creates, where I talk about all things sewing. Today, I'm bringing you a sew along for the Adrienne Blouse by Friday Pattern Company. This blouse is a project that you can do in a knit fabric. It's something that I think would be really suitable for someone who is a beginner to using knit or jersey fabrics. You just want to make sure that your fabric has a pretty high percentage of stretch because it's pretty stretchy and fitted once you finished it. So once you have your fabric and your pattern, which you can buy directly from the company, I will link that below, then come back here and we'll get started. I have my pattern pieces all taped together, and now it's time to choose the size that I'm going to cut out of this pattern. It's hard to tell, honestly, by looking at the model what size you might want, since she has the worst posture I have ever seen. So it's kind of hard to tell the fit from that. So we're just going to ignore the pattern photo for now and look at the size chart. If you read the instructions, it says this top has a bodycon fit through the bodice and loose billowy sleeves. So for me, I'm not completely sure how much of a bodycon fit I really want, because I don't like things to be tight around my stomach. So I'm going to probably give myself a little bit of extra room as it goes down through the body. So I've gone and I've circled the size that I fall into for my bust, which is a medium, my waist, which is a large, and my hips, which is also a medium. So I'm one size larger in their sizing chart on the waist than I am in the bust and the hips, which is pretty normal for me. This is what I have to cut for most patterns. So then we'll go down to the finished garment measurements and see how much ease it's actually allowing. So for the size medium, which is for 36 to 37 inches in the bust, the finished size is 30.5 inches. So that's at least, for me, that would be 5.5 inches of negative ease. I'm kind of okay with that in the bust. Since it's made from a knit, it should be smaller, but that is actually quite a lot of negative ease. But I do think, because I want the shoulders to fit properly, I'm gonna stay with the medium for the bust size, and I think that'll probably be okay. If you look at the finished waist measurements for the large, it's 30.5, which would give me about an inch of negative ease. So I actually think that I'm gonna go ahead and grade out between the medium and actually the extra large for the waist, because I wanna make sure that it's not skin tight, because if it's skin tight, I know I will never wear it. And it's also relatively easy to take things in at the sides at the end, so it's always a good idea, if you're not sure, give yourself some extra fabric to play with. And then it doesn't have a hip measurement because it's supposed to be short, so I'll probably just go ahead and keep it cut at the extra large size for the hips. The other question is whether or not I'm going to want to lengthen it any, and in order to figure that out, I'm actually going to measure off of one of the tops that I've already made from a different pattern. It does say that it's drafted for a height of 5 foot 5 inches, and I'm somewhere between 5'7" and 5'8", so it's probably going to be the case that I'm going to need to add some length, since this says that it's supposed to cut off right below the belly button. So let me go grab a top that I can measure the pattern piece off of and just get an idea of how much length I might need to add. All right, so I'm just going to cut out my Adrienne blouse. And I'm using a rotary cutter and a self-healing mat to cut on, because this is the way I cut everything out. Scissors don't work well for my hands, and this is much faster for me. If you use a rotary cutter, always, always, always be safe. Notice mine has the safety on right now. Never leave the safety out when you set it down. Never put your finger on the top like that. I would not recommend that. It's too easy to slip off. And don't put your hand in front of the rotary cutter at any time, because you're gonna have a bad day if you do that. But other than that, don't be scared. I think they're much easier to use. I always use a different blade or a different rotary cutter when I cut my pattern versus when I cut my fabric, because the paper is going to dull the blade, and that's going to be no good when you go to cut your fabric out. So I've decided that I'm going to cut between a medium and an extra large. So you will notice there is a lengthen and shorten line here, but there is not any kind of a mark that shows you where the waist is supposed to be. I guess we can assume that it's probably somewhere around this side notch, but there's no marking, so we don't know. There is an FBA line, which is really nice if you need a full bust adjustment. I'm not going to do one. I generally do not need one. Even though I wear a D cup and a bra, my sewing cup size, which means the difference between my bust and my high bust, is only an inch. So generally speaking, I do not need an FBA with any patterns. So if we're assuming that's the bust point, sure, let's say it is, then I'm going to start to go ahead and cut out. And you can draw the line that you want to do, or you can kind of freehand it. I'm probably going to freehand it, to be honest, but if you have a French curve, that's a great thing to use to draw in that marking to make sure you're not going crazy. So I'm going to cut this out. Alright, I do feel like I probably want to add some length to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut along the line that says lengthen or shorten here. Okay. Then I'm going to get a piece of paper like this one that I cut off to put in there. I'm going to use my ruler again. I think I'm going to give it about 2 inches. Okay. So we want to add 2 inches, and this line needs to stay straight. So let's see here. This piece is about 2.5 inches, so we can just go ahead and cut that down right on the pattern. So we want 2 inches. I measure from the other side of my ruler. We want 2 inches. Just line everything up, make sure that's even. It is. Use your fingers to hold your ruler down. Just cut it off. If you've done any quilting, shift it a little. If you've done any quilting, this will be super familiar. Stop, walk your fingers, and keep going. All right, so I've got a 2-inch wide strip of paper, roughly. I'm gonna wanna place it in here. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna tape it in right here. I still don't know how this is gonna work. And I am gonna have to adjust my curve some because it's a little bit too extreme now. So let me just tape this in place. All right, and so then I'm probably just gonna correct this curve right here. I think I'm gonna cut like that, and that'll give us a nice even but lengthened shape. All right, I have pinned my pattern piece to my fabric, and now I'm going to cut it out. I made sure that I measured to make sure that it's straight, so I measured this down to the fold down here to make sure that it's in a straight line, which it is. So I'm going to go ahead and cut around these sides, but not cut down the middle. Okay, so before I flip it over, I'm just going to mark where my center front is and center back. This is just going to make it easier when I turn the pattern over. All right, that's all cut out. Now I'm just going to make sure, let's remove this fabric, just going to make sure that I have all of my pattern marks right where they need to be. So, mark all my notches. I always use pen or chalk. I never, ever cut in because I always feel like you might need. Okay, there's one piece. Let's mark the other piece on the wrong side. I need to mark center front again because it did not stay marked, didn't go through. All right, so go to your iron and press your two neckband pieces in half with the wrong sides together. Anytime in here that I say press, press. I know it's a knit and maybe your knit doesn't hold a press that well, but it will make an enormous difference in your finished product. This is a double brushed poly. It sort of holds a press. It holds enough of a press that I know where this is. So we're gonna pin this to our neckline and sew it on. So the first thing you're actually probably going to want to do is figure out where the center of these two pieces are. So I would just fold them in half and then mark that. I think I'm actually going to mark mine with a pin because I think that's going to be easier if I do it that way. So find the center. Where's that center? Right here. Mark that with a pin. All right, same thing with this one. Okay, find that center and just mark it with the pen. Okay, make sure your edges are still pretty even. Okay, now you're gonna wanna take one of your body pieces, okay, and then right sides together, you're going to need to pin this piece to this piece. So you're going to start by pinning each edge, go through all 3 layers of fabric, right at the edge like that. Okay, same thing over here. Then you're going to want to find the mark that you made in the center. So this is your center front, center back, whichever piece this is. And you're just going to match up that with the pin that we just made, or the mark that you made if you used a marking tool to do that. And we're just going to pin through all 3 layers there. All right, so now we will need to pin all of this on before we can go to the machine. So what I would do is hold it out like this and just see kind of where they fall together. And then I just will take the center of that and I'll go ahead and put a pin right through it. Okay? Now, you can continue to pin if you like, or if you don't like to pin, you can just say, well, that's good enough. I'm gonna probably do 1 more pin in each half, a quarter, I guess, of this neck piece, right like that. Then I'm gonna do the same thing over here. Find a center, there we go. You can estimate, it doesn't have to be exact. You just wanna make sure that you're not starting at one end and then pinning and ending up with one side that's much more stretched than the other side. So, I'm gonna do 1 more on each side of this. And then you will repeat the same thing with your other pieces. All right, so I just want to show you the setup that I'm using for sewing this on my machine. The first thing that you're going to need is a jersey needle. I used a size 80-12. These will make a difference because when you sew your fabric, it won't skip stitches. So definitely don't use a universal needle if you have any way of getting these. They sell them at all the fabric stores. And then I have to set up my machine for sewing on knits. So what I've done is, you can see here that I've set it for a zigzag stitch. And then I have set my stitch width for 0.4. That's how wide the zigzag itself is. And then I have set my stitch length, so how often it makes a stitch, for 1.8. And that's kind of where I start with most knits if I'm going to sew them on the regular machine. So once you've sewn that, here's what it's going to look like. So you can see that it's definitely a zigzag, but it's not super duper wavy. So if I take this and I pull on it, which I try to do with one hand, but you can see that it does stretch. And you want to really aggressively pull on that when you're setting up your stitches to make sure that it's not going to pop when you just make normal movements. And then from the right side, I have not pressed this, but you can see that it's just going to make a nice seam. You won't be able to tell at all. And I'll use this for all internal seams unless I use my serger. All right, and then I also want to get an idea of what it's going to sew like if I use my serger. I have my serger set up for 4-thread overlock. If you need a serger, by the way, this is one I would recommend. It's the Juki MO654DE. Very sturdy, better than the Brother that everybody recommends, and only a little bit more. All right, so I sewed this for 4-thread overlock, which means that it's got 2 straight stitches running, which is going to give you a little bit more safety from popping threads if you move crazy. So the stitching itself looks great, except for here at the beginning. I don't know why it does that, but it's still, I think it's all right. Stretchiness wise, very stretchy. Definitely not going to pull apart with that stitch. And then from the right side of the fabric, it just looks like a normal seam. You can't see, and no, my serger thread does not match, and no, it does not matter, unless you can see it from the front, which you can't in this. So All right, so now I have the choice of using either one to sew my garment. All right, so here we are at the machine with our neckband pieces pinned to our fronts. I ended up adding some more pins because I didn't feel like what I had was going to stay unwrinkled. So we're just going to pull our threads to the back, place this under the presser foot, just lower the presser foot. I am using a walking foot. It's not required. If you have access to a walking foot, it will make sewing your knits easier because it's going to make sure that all of your knits kind of feed through without getting wrinkles in them. But it's not required. You can certainly sew a knit with just a regular, plain, straight stitch foot. All right, so needle down. I may sew through pins. I may not. I sew very slowly and I'm not that concerned, but don't come to me if you get a needle in your eye from sewing over the pins. So don't necessarily do as I do on this part. It just makes it easier for me to keep the fabric from getting wrinkled. So sewing right over that, just making sure nothing's wrinkled under there. Needle up, trim your thread, trim your thread at the other end. All right, so then take out all of these pins and see how it ended up. All right, so looking here, we didn't get any weird puckers. So now we can look at the seam from the right side, and I think that looks great. Do the same thing for the other piece you have pinned. Now we have both of our neckband pieces sewn on to our front and back pieces with smooth stitch, no puckers. I went ahead and turned the seam allowance down. The pattern mentions that you could top stitch it in place if you wanted to, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to see that stitching on the right side. So I'm just going to trim the excess seam allowance here to about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch, and you won't be able to see that from the outside of the garment. All right, now repeat that on the other side, and then we'll move on to sew the side seams. All right, now we'll need to pin the front and back sides together, right sides together. We're going to pin along the side seams, and then we'll go ahead and sew up our side seams. All right, now I'm going to use my serger to sew my side seams because I know they're going to need to stretch, but you could do this on your regular machine with the lengthened zigzag stitch that we talked about before, and it would work just as well. So here I go. It's going to be noisy. All right, I think that stitch looks great, so I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. All right, so those side seams are sewn and I pressed them toward the back. There is a cat here trying to help. So now we're just gonna set that piece aside and work on the sleeves a little bit. So I have already pressed under 5/8 of an inch, which I measured with my seam gauge, with wrong sides together on the very top of the sleeve. And this is going to be the casing for our elastic. So now I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to use that zigzag stitch to sew a 1/2 inch from the top, and I'll be right back. All right, so we have our elastic casing sewn, and the next thing we'll need to do is cut our elastic to thread through there. So I have 1/2 inch braided elastic. I got black. It doesn't probably really matter unless you have a really light colored fabric. So the pattern says that I need 7 inches. So I'm just going to measure 7 inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then I'm just going to cut right there. One piece. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm going to cut it right there. All right, so then the next thing you'll need to do is thread this through. So to thread elastic, you need to attach one end to a safety pin. Okay, and then you're going to thread that through there. And then you'll just keep pulling. So the casing in this pattern is the same size as the elastic it calls for, which in my experience is actually a little bit unusual. Usually be a little bit smaller, but hopefully that's going to give it a really smooth look when it's done. So just keep pulling, straighten your fabric back out. When you get to the end, you'll actually need another safety pin, and just safety pin it right to here so you don't lose it on the inside. Let me grab another safety pin. All right, so still pushing this through here. Getting to the end there on this part. So once that gets kind of close to the end like that, you don't want to lose it inside because it'll be hard to get out. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin that right like that so you can't lose it. And then just keep going over here and let all of the fabric just kind of gather itself up along the shoulders. So there's all nicely gathered up. You've got this. So then what you're going to do is you're going to sew the opening here closed, just close to the edge, and you'll want the elastic to be pretty flush with the edge when you do that. And you can do that with just a straight stitch. You just want to make sure it's not going to go anywhere. So do that on either side on both sleeves. And here's how that looks once it's all sewn together. Really love the effect of that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew up our side seams on our sleeves. So that's going to be, here's your raglan seam. Here is the side of your sleeve. So you're just going to pin these two sides together, right sides together, and sew them up just the way that you did the side seams of the body. All right, my side seams are sewn in my sleeves. So now it's time to pin and sew the sleeves to the body. So what you'll want to do is take right sides together, and you're going to want to match up the underarm seam, right? See that? And then match up the collar edges and pin that, and sew that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I have sewn in my sleeves, and I've tried on to check for the fit, and I'm really happy with the way that it fits and the changes that I made. I definitely think I needed the extra 2 inches in length that I added to the body. These shoulders fit really nicely with the length of elastic that is given in the pattern. I went ahead and trimmed down my seams on the inside to about 1/4 of an inch. So now we are nearly done. The only thing left to do is hem the sleeves and the bottom and insert the elastic into the sleeves. So I went ahead and pre-cut my pieces of elastic. Again, this is 1/2 inch elastic, and I'm going to, I cut mine actually, I made a medium, but I cut mine to the extra small length because I know that I have pretty small, skinny forearms, and this isn't even going to be touching my skin at the 10 inches that I cut it at. So this is the length of elastic that I'm going to use, but the pattern did call for 11 inches of elastic. And I did go ahead and look at the pattern, and I'm probably going to sew. So I'm going to turn under these sleeves by 5/8 of an inch to the inside. And then the instructions say to sew at 5/8 of an inch, which to me doesn't make any sense because that's nonsense. Like if you fold it under 5/8 of an inch, then you're gonna run off the edge if you try to sew there. So I'm gonna sew it at 1/2 an inch, the same way that we did the elastic casing on the shoulders, leaving a 2-inch opening. And then I'm gonna insert the elastic in there. And at the same time I do that, I'm gonna go ahead and hem my top. I tried it on, the length is good. I'll be able to wear it untucked or tucked in, and I don't think I would have felt comfortable with either way, actually, if I hadn't added the extra length. So I'm going to turn it up. The instructions say turn it up 1/2 an inch and hem it at 1/2 an inch, which again doesn't make any sense to me. So we're not gonna do that. I'm gonna turn it up 5/8 of an inch, and then I'm gonna hem. I'm gonna sew 1/2 inch in from the folded edge, and that'll give me 5/8 an inch for my seam allowance. That 1/2 an inch is just where you actually sew it. And once I've done that, then I'll sew the casing closed on the sleeves, and it will be done. So I will be back after I have sewn my hems to show you inserting the elastic. Okay, I pressed my hem allowances under by 5/8 of an inch, and now I'm ready to sew the casing for my elastic and my bottom hem. And I just want to show you what my settings are on my machine for this. So it is set for a regular zigzag stitch, and the width of the zigzag, so that's kind of how far it zags, right, is 0.2, which is very, very, very narrow. My stitch length I have set right now is 2. It will need to be longer than you probably think that it will. The length that it's set for when you just turn on your zigzag stitch, at least in my machine, is way, way too short to work for using it on knits like this. So, and this will give a little bit of stretch to your finished stitch, which will be helpful. It's not going to look exactly like a straight stitch, but I think it looks fine, and I would not worry about it. All right, so I'm going to start just right before this pin right here. And then I'm going to stop when I get to this pin over here on the other side. So we're going to start, we're doing a 1/2 an inch. Just make sure you're not stretching anything, because if you stretch, you're not going to have a very good day sewing this. So, all right, it's a little bit too close to the 5/8 inch line. Here we go. Alright, so needle down. I have to hold my thread tails in the back, especially with a knit on this machine. It just loves to suck them down and tangle up on the back. So I've got to hold this for the first few stitches. So here we go. And then I can let it go. threads. All right, so let's take a look at what that looks like. I mean, honestly, I have to look at that to realize it's not a straight stitch. But if I pull on it, it's got a little bit of give to it. Now, I'm not going to yank on it like crazy because it's still just one stitch, but overall, I think it looks really good. I'm going to do the same thing. It got a little bobbly here, kind of around my seam line. I didn't love that, but we got it to work. And here is where we're going to insert our elastic for the bottom of the sleeves. While I'm already at the machine for sewing up my sleeve hems, which I have done, I'm going to go ahead and sew the bottom hem. So I've turned that up by 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to sew 1/2 of an inch from the outer edge. And I'm going to sew this with the wrong side facing up because I find that easier to do, to make sure that I'm catching that whole seam allowance and there isn't any place where there's a hole in the hem. Again, I'm still using a stretch stitch because this is a tight shirt. It's definitely going to need that. Now it's time to insert the elastic into the sleeve arms. So I'm just going to go ahead and take one of my pieces of elastic and attach a safety pin to one end. Make sure you get pretty far in, otherwise it has the risk of tearing out. Okay. Make sure it's not twisted. And then you can go ahead and pull out the other end as well. You want to make sure that you have a grip on that before you take the safety pin off that side, because it's going to want to spring back in there. Okay. Now what we're going to have to do, hold on to both of them, is actually sew these together. So I would overlap them a little bit like that. Take the other pin out, and then what you can do is you can go to the machine and just sew these together, and you can use a straight stitch, zigzag, whatever, doesn't matter, just so they're not going to go anywhere. Once you do that, then you'll be able to finish this seam and just sew the rest of the hem with the elastic inside there. And that's our last step. I hope that you enjoyed this sew along. If you have any comments, you can leave them down below, and I'll be sure to get back to you with answers to any questions that you might have. In conclusion, I actually really liked this pattern. I thought it was enjoyable to sew up. I had a couple little quibbles with the instructions that I addressed in the sew along itself if you were following along, but I think it's a really flattering blouse. I love the shoulder treatment, which is just so flattering, I think. But yeah, definitely glad that you were here and you sewed along with me today. So happy sewing, and I hope you have a great week.